The book that changed my life is 1984 by George Orwell.
So can you remember your initial kind of response to it?
I know how it felt to read it, and that's one of the reasons I chose it for this as a novel that changed my life, because I'd never read a book that affected me, that got under my skin in quite that way. I'd always been a really avid reader, but I'd read sad books, actually. I'd had a lovely cry, you know, like you do when the hero dies or whatever. This was something completely different. This was a really bleak, hopeless, grey kind of book, and I remember in some ways not even really enjoying it. I'd sort of put it down and think, well, I'm not reading that anymore. It's too depressing. It's too sad. I can't deal with it. But I was always drawn back to it. It was I remember, I mean, I was quite, I was an emotional 15-year-old girl at this point, remember, but so all my reactions were quite enthusiastic. But I do remember kind of walking around under this kind of dark cloud for 2 weeks while I read it, just feeling this kind of bone deep despairing kind of feeling, but really wanting to keep reading because I knew I wanted to find out what happened next, and I could tell that I was in the presence of a really kind of great writer, I suppose. So yeah, it was pretty full on as a reading experience.
Yeah. So what was it about the story that kind of got you so gripped you? Or was it the writing or the story?
I think it was partly just the writing, just his ability to conjure up this really kind of, I know I'm really selling it to people here, this really kind of grey, repressive society that everybody was living in. But, I think it still was written in a really crisp style. It was dynamic. You wanted to turn the page and find out what happened next. I desperately wanted to know that something good was going to happen next. I won't spoil anybody and tell them whether it does. But yeah, I think for me, I think it was the atmosphere that the writing conjured up, but also that kind of page turning. It's an adventure story in some ways as well as everything else. I think that was part of it. That's why I had to keep picking it up and reading it again, even though I really didn't want to be in that world anymore.
And also there's like a lot of interesting language and play on language in the book, isn't there? Like there's double speak and the whole Big Brother and that. Yeah. Had you come across that kind of use of language before in books you'd read?
No, and it was fascinating. That was really interesting. And I do remember being really drawn to that aspect of it. And also really, I mean, when I say it changed my life, it did make me think about things that I'd never thought about before. I think I was quite a naive kind of 15-year-old in lots of ways. And the idea that language could do that it could shut down debate like that was a new thing to me. And there were other new things in that book that I had never really had to think about before. So I think for me, that's kind of why it was a bit of a coming of age book, really. I had to think about more difficult stuff than I'd ever had to think about before, probably.
So do you think it affected the way you saw the world after reading it?
It did. I mean, there's a whole, like there's obviously this big repressive government, big repressive society that exists in the book. And there were two things about that I remember very vividly. The first, I was reading it on the school bus one day, and an older girl who I sometimes spoke to said, "Oh yes, it's ever so good." And of course, it's awful, isn't it, that this kind of thing still goes on? And I was like, what? this kind of thing happens? Because like I said, I was quite naive. I didn't read a lot of newspapers. I read a lot of fiction. And I had no idea. I mean, looking at it now, it's so obvious, and there are so many parallels with the way our society works now that it almost feels like he probably wrote it yesterday. But at the time, I hadn't that real world. So there was that. And there's also the fact that, I had this gut reaction that this was not the way a society should be run, and this wasn't the way that people should live. But when Winston, the main character, talks to anybody in the ruling party, they have this incredible circular logic that justifies it. And I had no language, I had no I'd never studied philosophy or anything like that. I had no way of arguing against that. And I remember being quite scared by that, actually, because I thought, well, how do you stop this happening? You know, if you can't make the case that this is wrong because there's no logical reason why it's wrong, what do we do? So I remember that really getting to me. And, you know, later on in life, I started to look at a bit of political philosophy and things, and I found the language and the places that you could go to find an argument against it. But I'd never come across arguments that argued so logically for something that I knew was so wrong and had no way to kind of challenge it, which was another reason I didn't really want to carry on reading it, because it was terrifying. But, you know, very educational.
That's fascinating, because so many people discover it around that age when so much seems repressive and so hard to articulate against as well. So I'm sure a lot of people really relate to that position of Winston in the book. So
yeah, and I think I was thinking about it the other day, when I knew I had to go and talk about this, that dystopian fiction is a really big thing in young adult writing now, isn't it? But I don't know if it was particularly then. I think, to me, I don't know if I'd come across a great deal of other dystopian novels at all. And I think as well, there's always a little bit of hope in current things. I mean, in the Hunger Games, there's a whole load of people who she meets, who she can trust, who she can fight with. There's something about 1984 that just feels a bit hopeless. It's a sort of different level almost, but I think it's probably one of the earliest dystopian novels, possibly. I might be wrong about that. I might be showing my lack of...
I mean, Brave New World was the other one.
Yeah, which was what about...
That was a bit more hopeful.
Yeah. It certainly looked like more fun living in a Brave New World than 1984, I've got to say.
Did you feel kind of a bit like, oh no, you know?
Yeah. And I know it seems, for that reason, in some ways, a really weird choice to choose, but I just look back on it as it was a very powerful experience, if that doesn't sound too pretentious. And as a reader, I'd never come across a book that had such a big effect on me. And I went on and I studied English literature at university and American literature and all that kind of thing. And I just look back on that as a book that I read that made me understand what writing can do. It doesn't just have to tell you a nice story and make you cry at the end. It can do something else, and really sort of change the way you feel and the way you see things. So I think, for me, when I say it changed my life, I think it changed me as a reader almost more than anything else. And I'll tell you, I have never read it since, because well, for a while, I didn't want to read it. I remember when I finished reading it, I hid it in my dad's bookshelf between two Jeeves and Wooster books, because it was just too scary. Like I used to hide my Snow Queen under Winnie the Pooh when I was little. You might want to cut that.
So you sort of identified it as a dangerous book almost.
Almost, yeah. It was certainly one that I felt, I need to put this somewhere with something safe and nice. Yeah, this doesn't belong just floating around my house. And the other reason I've never read it is because now I'm older and I've read a lot more stuff. I don't know if it'd have the same effect. And although it was it wasn't particularly enjoyable in some ways, I do look back on it fondly as like the first time a book really hit me in the face, and in a way that good books can, I think.